Okay, good morning. Page 564. I'm a little bit late this morning. But I did just find out that my best friend doesn't have cancer, so that's great. So, chapter 21, Campside. Like a piece of rotten meat, which not only stinks right on its own surface, but also surrounds itself with a stinking molecular cloud of stink. So too, each island of the archipelago created and supported a zone of stink around itself. This zone, more extensive than the archipelago itself, was the intermediate transmission zone between the small zone of each individual island and the big zone, the big camp compound, comprising the entire country. Everything of the most infectious nature in the archipelago, in human relations, morals, views, and language, in compliance with the universal law of osmosis in plant and animal tissue, seeped first into this transmission zone and then dispersed through the entire country. It was right here in the transmission zone that those elements of camp ideology and culture worthy of entering into the nationwide culture underwent trial and selection, and when camp expressions ring in the corridors of the new building of the Moscow State University, or when an independent woman in the capital delivers a verdict wholly from out of camp on the essence of life, don't be surprised. It got there via the transmission zone, via Campside. While the government attempted, or perhaps did not attempt, to re-educate the prisoners through slogans, the cultural and educational section, censorship of mail, and the security chiefs, the prisoners more swiftly re-educated the entire country through Campside. The thieves of philosophy, which initially had conquered the archipelago, easily swept further and captured the all-union ideological market, a wasteland without any stronger ideology. The camp tenacity, its cruelty in human relations, its armor of insensitivity over the heart, its hostility to any kind of conscientious work, all this effortlessly tamed Campside without difficulty, and then went on to make a deep impression on all freedom. Thus it is that the archipelago takes its vengeance on the Soviet Union for its creation. Thus it is that no cruelty whatsoever passes by without impact. Thus it is that we always pay dearly for chasing after what is cheap. To give a list of these places, these hick towns, these settlements, would be almost the same as recapitulating the geography of the entire archipelago. There wasn't a single camp compound which could ever exist on its own. Next door to it, there had been a settlement of free people, sometimes a settlement at some temporary logging camp, or other would stand there several years and disappear along with the camp. Sometimes it would put down roots, get a name, a town Soviet, a branch line, and stay there forever. And sometimes famous cities would grow up out of these settlements, like Magadan, Dudinka, Igarka, Temirtau, Balkhash, Dezhezh, Kazgan, Angren, Taishet, Bratsk, Sovetskaya, Gavin. These settlements festered not only in the outposts of the wilderness, but also in the very torso of Russia, around the mines of the Donbass and Tula, next to peat diggings, next to agricultural camps. Sometimes entire districts were infected and belonged to the world of Campside, like Tonchaevo. And when a camp was injected into the body of a big city, even Moscow itself, Campside also existed, not in the form of a special settlement, but in the form of those separate individuals who flowed away from it every night on trolley buses and motor buses, and who were drawn back into it again every morning. In these cases, the transmission of the infection proceeded outside at an accelerated rate. There were also such towns as Kizel on the Perm mining and metallurgical branch line. They had begun their existence before there was any archipelago, but subsequently turned out to be surrounded by a multitude of camps, and thus were transformed into provincial camps of the archipelago. Such a city would be permeated by the camp atmosphere. The camp officers and groups of the camp guards would go afoot or ride through it in droves. Like occupying forces, the camp administration would be the city's main institution. The telephone network would not belong to the city but to the camps. The bus routes would all lead from the city center to the camps, and all the town inhabitants would earn their living off the camps. The largest of such provincial capitals of the archipelago was Karaganda. It was created by and filled with exiles and former prisoners to such a degree that a veteran Czech could not walk the street without running into old acquaintances. The city had several camp administrations, and individual camps were scattered all around it like sands of the sea. Who lived in Campside? 1. The basic indigenous local inhabitants. There might be none. 2. The militarized camp guards. 3. The camp officers and their families. 4. The jailers and their families. And jailers, as distinct from camp guards, always lived with their families, even when they were listed as on military service. 5. Former Czechs, released from the local camp or one nearby. 6. Various restricted persons, half-repressed people with unclean passports, like the former Czechs. They too were here not of their own free will, but of necessity, even if the particular place had not been assigned them as though they were exiles. It would be worse for them anywhere else in regard to both working and housing, and they might not even have been allowed to live anywhere else. Anyway. 7. The work administration. These were highly placed people and constituted in all only a few people in a big settlement, and sometimes there were none at all. 8. Then, too, there were the free employees, the volnyashki, proper, all the tramps and riffraff, all kinds of strays and good-for-nothings, and seekers of easy money. After all, in these remote death traps, you could work 3 times as poorly as a metropolis and get 4 times the wages, with the bonuses for the Arctic, for remoteness and for hardship, and you could also steal the work of the prisoners. And in addition, many flocked there under recruitment programs and on contract, receiving moving and traveling expenses as well. For those able to pan the gold out of the work sheets, Campside was a real Klondike. People swarmed there, and forged diplomas, adventurers, rascals, and money grabbers poured in. It was particularly advantageous here for those who needed the free use of someone else's brains. A semi-illiterate geologist would have Czech geologists carry out field observations, worked them up, drawn all the conclusions, and then he himself could go defend his dissertation in the metropolis. They sent here the total failures and those who were simply hopeless drunks. Men came here after their families had broken up or to avoid alimony. Then too they were the young graduates of technical schools who had failed to get themselves into cushy spots when obligatory jobs were being assigned. But from the very first day of their arrival here, they began to try to get back to the civilized world, and whoever couldn't manage it in 1 year's time would certainly be able to do it now. Do it in 2, sorry. But there was also quite a different category among the free employees, the elderly who had lived in Campside for whole decades and had become so assimilated to its atmosphere that they no longer needed some other, sweeter world. In their camp shut down, or if the administration stopped paying them what they demanded, they left. But invariably they would move to some other such zone near a camp. They knew no other way to live. The situation of Vasily Aksentevich Frolov, a great drunkard, a cheat, and a famous master of casting, about whom I could tell many tales, except that I have already described him, without any diploma, and despite the fact that he had drunk down his last skill as a master, he never received less than 5,000 pre-Khrushchev rubles in a month. In the most general sense of the word, Volnyashka means just any free person, and in other words, any citizen of the Soviet Union not yet arrested or already released, and therefore every citizen of Campside. But most of this word was used in their archipelago in the narrow sense. The Volnyashka is a particular kind of free person who worked alongside prisoners in the same work compound. By this token, those groups 1, 5, 6 above who came to the camp work compound to work were also Volnyashki. Volnyashki were hired as construction superintendents, foremen, head foremen, warehouse managers, excuse me, and norm setters. In addition, they were hired for the posts in which the employment of sex would have made the work of the convoy much more difficult. Drivers, draymen, dispatchers, tractor drivers, excavator operators, scraper operators, electrical linemen, night firemen. The second-class Volnyashki, ordinary sloggers like Zaks, made friends with us right away without nonsense, and did everything forbidden by the camp regiment and by criminal law. They willingly deposited the Zaks letters in free mailboxes of the settlement. They took and sold at the local free markets clothes the Zaks had pinched and kept the money, bringing the Zaks some grub. Together with the Zaks, they plundered the project. They brought vodka into the work compound, despite very strict inspection at the gatehouse. They would drop flasks of vodka and with tarred necks into the gasoline tanks of automobiles. And wherever it was possible to credit the Zaks work to free people, the foreman and the head foreman were not at all squeamish about crediting themselves too. This was invariably done. After all, work credited to a person did nothing for anyone. No one paid any money for it, but only gave them a bread ration, and that was why in unrationed times it made good sense to complete the Zaks worksheet any old way, just so there was no serious trouble, and to credit the Zaks work to a free man. The Volnyashka got money for it, and he ate and drank himself, and he gave his own sex something to eat as well. And so in general, you could not call the relations between the Zeks and the Volnyashki hostile. Instead, they were friendly, and these lost, half-drunken, ruined people were more sensitive to the grief of others, were capable of paying heed to the grief of a prisoner and the injustice of his arrest. The eyes of an unprejudiced human were open to what the eyes of the officers, jailers, and guards were closed to because of their position. The relations between Sex and the foreman and the head foreman of the were more complex. As commanders of production, they were put there to squeeze the prisoners and drive them, but they were answerable for the course of the work, and the work couldn't always be carried out in a condition of direct hostility between them and the Zeks. Not everything can be got by hunger and the stick. Sometimes things required willing agreement, both by inclination and by imagination. And the foremen who were successful were those who reached an understanding with the brigadiers and with the best of the skilled craftsmen among the prisoners. And the foremen themselves were not just drunks, and not simply enfeebled and poisoned by the constant employment of slave labor. They were also illiterate, and either knew nothing of their line of work, or else knew it very badly, and because of this were even more dependent on the brigadiers. And how interestingly, Russian faith sometimes intertwined there. A carpenter's foreman, Fyodor Ivanovich Muravlov, came to us in his cups before a holiday, and bared his soul to the brigadier painters, Bryukov, an outstanding master of trade, a serious, steadfast fellow who was serving out his 10th year. What, you're serving time, you kulak's son? Your father kept plowing away at the land and accumulated cows, and figured he would take it all off to the kingdom of heaven. Sorry. And where is he now? Died in exile, and they imprisoned you too? Not my father was smarter than that. No, my father was smarter than that. From his earliest years he drank down everything, and our hut was empty. He didn't even give his chickens to the collective farm, because he didn't have any, or anything else. And right off they made him a brigadier, and I took after him, drinking vodka, and I know no grief. Excuse me, I'll take a drink here. And as it turned out, he was right. Sinya Bryukov, after serving out his sentence, would be sent off to exile, and Muravlov would become the chairman of the Trade Commission, the Trade Union Committee on Construction. True, the construction superintendent, Butlov, could not wait to get rid of this chairman of the local trade union committee and foreman. It was impossible to get rid of him. It was a personnel department that hired, not the construction superintendent. And the personnel department would often select loafers and dolts out of a feeling of kinship. The construction superintendent answered for all the materials and wage fund out of his own pocket, but Muravlov, out of illiteracy, or else because he was a simpleton and he was not at all a malicious character, and because of his the brigadiers used to carry him, would squander that wage fund, sign unexamined work, vouchers which brigadiers would fill in themselves, and accept badly done work, which would then have to be broken up and done over again. And Butlov would have been glad to replace that kind of foreman with a Zek engineer who was working there with a pick, but because of vigilance, the personnel department did not permit this. Well, now tell me, what length beams do you have at the monument on the site? Mirilov sighed deeply. For the time being, I hesitate to tell you exactly. And the drunken Miravulov got the more impudently he used to speak to the construction superintendent, and at that point the construction superintendent decided to besiege him with paperwork. Despite the time it cost, he began to put all his orders in writing, keeping carbons in a file. These orders were not executed. Of course, a fearsome case was being built up, but chairman of the local union was not a loss. He was himself a half-sheet of wrinkled notebook paper. He got himself a half-sheet of wrinkled notebook paper and took half an hour to scrawl out with difficulty, clumsily, 1. I bring Toyer information that all mechanics which are for carbony work in not working order, which is in a bad state, and exclusively do not work, unquote. The construction superintendent was quite a different level of work management. For the prisoners, he had a constant oppressor and a constant enemy. The construction superintendent would not enter into friendly relations with the brigadiers or into deals with them. He used to cut back their worksheets, expose their tukta to the extent that he was smart enough, and he could always punish a brigadier and any prisoner through the camp administration. To the camp lieutenant, quote, I request you to punish in the severest manner, preferably a punishment cell, but with his being taken out to work, the brigadier of the cement workers, the prisoner Zazulia, and the foreman, the prisoner Orshevsky, for casting slabs thicker than the indicated measurement, in which was expressed an over-expenditure of cement. Simultaneously, I wish to inform you that this day in dealing with me on the question of registering the volume of work in the worksheets, the prisoner Brigadier Alexeyev insulted the foreman, Comrade Tumarkin, calling him a jackass. Such conduct on the part of the prisoner Alexeyev, which undermines the authority of a free administration, I consider extremely undesirable and even dangerous, and I beg you to take the firmest measures up to and including his being sent away on a prisoner transport, unquote. Senior construction supervisor Buslov. This very same Tumarkin had in a suitable moment been called a jackass by Buslov himself, but the Zek brigadier, on the basis of his worth, deserved a prisoner transport. Buslov sent the camp chiefs such notes nearly every day. He saw the camp punishments as the highest form of work stimulus. Buslov was one of those work bosses who had worked himself into the Gulag system and who had adapted himself to the ways of getting things done. That's what he said at meetings. I quote, I have long experience of working with the Zeks, and I do not fear their threats to flatten me with a brick, unquote. But he regretted the Gulag generations had changed for the worse. The people who came to the camp after war, after Europe, turned out to be disrespectful types. Quote, but working in 1937, you understand that was pure pleasure. For example, when a free employee entered, the Zeks invariably rose to their feet, unquote. Buslov knew both how to deceive the prisoners and how to put them in dangerous situations, and he never spared their strength, nor their stomach, nor still less their vanity. Long
long-legged, wearing yellow American Oxford donated to needy Soviet citizens, which he had received through UNRRA. He perpetually rushed around the floors of the construction, knowing that otherwise the lazy, dirty beings called Zeka would be sitting in all his corners and crannies, lying, warming themselves, looking for life, or even copulating, notwithstanding the urgency of the short 10-hour working day, and the brigadiers would be crowding the Norm's office and writing up tukta, false figures, on worksheets. And out of all the foremen there was only one on whom he partially relied, Fyodor Vasilievich Gorshkov. He was a puny old guy with a bristling gray mustaches. He had a keen understanding of the construction. He knew both his work and the contiguous to his, and his principal and usual trait among the Volnyashki was the fact that he had an honest interest in the outcome of the construction, not a pocket interest like Buslav, who they fine him or give him a bonus, curse him out or praise him, but an inner interest, just as if he were building the whole enormous building for himself and wanted it to be as good as possible. He was a careful drinker too, never lost sight of the construction, but he had one major shortcoming. He had not adjusted to the archipelago, and he was unaccustomed to keeping prisoners in terror. He also liked to go around the construction and peer searchingly with his own eyes. However, he did not rush about like Buslav, and he was not trying to catch those who were cheating, and he liked to sit down and to chat with the carpenters on the beams, with the bricklayers at their bricklaying, with the plasterers at their mixing box. Sometimes he shared candies with the Zeks, a wondrous thing to us. There was one kind of work which even in his old age he simply could not get along without: glass cutting. He always had his own diamond glass cutter in his pocket, and if someone started cutting glass in his presence, he would begin to hoot right off that they were cutting it wrong, and he would push the glass workers away and cut it himself. Buslav went for a month to Sochi, and Fyodor Vasilievich replaced him, but he refused flatly to sit in Buslav's office and remained right in the foreman's common room. The whole winter Gorshkov went about in an old Russian short potyovka, a waisted coat. Its collar had not grown threadbare, but the outside material was remarkably well preserved. They used to say that potyovka, that Gorshkov had been wearing it for going on 30 years without ever taking it off, and that before that his father had worn it for some years on holidays, and thus it developed that his father, Vasily Gorshkov, had been a government foreman, and that it was understandable why Fyodor Vasilievich liked brick and wood and glass and paint so much. From his childhood he had grown up in construction works, but even though the foremen there were then called government foremen, and even though they are not called government foremen now, the time they actually became government foremen is now, whereas before they were artists. And Fyodor Vasilievich would even now praise the old ways. What's a construction superintendent nowadays? He isn't able to shift even one kopeck from one place to another. In the old days, the contractor would come to the workers on Saturdays. Well, boys, will it be before or the bath or after? And they would answer, after, uncle, after. Well, here's your bath money, and from there to the tavern. The boys would pour out of the baths in a crowd, and the contractor would be waiting for them with vodka. snacks and samovar. Just try, after all that, to work badly on Monday. For us today, everything has a name, and we know everything about everything. This was it, this speed-up system, merciless exploitation, playing on the lowest human instincts, and the drinks and the spread that went with them weren't worth what squeezed out of the worker the following week. And a wet bread ration, hurled in it by indifferent hands from the window of the bread cutting room now, was that really worth it anymore? I'll have to take a break there. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day.